session is going to be about our first principle, honest process. And I'll invite our moderator, Sarah Lenti, and our three panelists. We have Ambassador Tim Romer, Zach Wamp, and Jason Carter coming up to the stage. Please feel free. And I will give it away to Sarah Lenti from the Principles for Trusted Elections Initiative.
Good morning. How are you? Good. So today we're going to talk about campaigns, and we're going to talk about candidates and how to ensure for an honest process during elections. So as you all know, candidates and parties are the visible face of our electoral process, and they set expectations and hopefully abide by norms and rules during that process. We've seen in recent campaign cycles that this isn't always the case. And so we're going to dig down into just that today. So all three of these panelists have campaigned for and served in elected office. So we've got Ambassador Romer, Congressman Wamp, and Jason Carter, who wants to be known as man of the people. No. But anyway, Jason Carter.
People.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, the first question, like I said, each of you have campaigned for office, served in public office. So a couple of questions. Do democratic norms exist on the campaign trail? And if so, how did you actually abide by them? And I know sounds very elementary, but let's just go back to square one. Anyone?
All right, I'll start. First of all, I just want to say that I am just honored and delighted and privileged to be here today. When the Carter and the Ford presidential centers come together to conduct an event like this, it resounds across America that a Republican and a Democratic presidential organization could say democracy matters. It is the most important issue to us today, and we are going to convene grassroots groups and individuals across party lines to articulate and express this concern. I'm also delighted to be at the University of Michigan as a Notre Dame fan. I'm a little intimidated being here by myself. I was at the big house not too long ago for my niece's graduation from the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, and we're very proud of her. She's up on Capitol Hill now working in politics. So another reason to be here. And the last thing I'll just say is as a former congressman, a former ambassador, a former 9/11 commissioner, people will often ask me, you got 4 kids, Tim? You're kind of in the retirement age. Spending time with your family, you've earned it, you deserve it. Why are you doing this work on democracy? And I say, because I've got 4 kids, because I've been a public service, because I care so much about America, this is exactly where I should be. I just came from California to DC, back here, back across the East Coast, and there couldn't be a more important time and a more important issue and more important people to be with. Zach and Jason, just delighted to and honored to be with you on the stage. I think, to your question, there are 3 things here. One, with norms, it's about political leadership, right? It is about people standing up to tell American citizens that democracy works, that democracy matters, and that this is the best system in the world, bar none. George Washington volunteered to step away from the job after unanimously being elected twice. King George said, that is the greatest man in the history of the world to give up power like that. That kind of presidential leadership being shown at the governor level, at the state level, at the local level is something we need more of today. Secondly, civic community response and support for norms is essential. 9/11, I lived through it, served on the 9/11 Commission, worked with the 9/11 families that lost sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. That community came together. Those families, when they lost people, imagine losing your son, your daughter, in an attack on our country. And they could have retreated. They could have gone away. They could have retired in grief. We wouldn't have blamed them for doing that. They instead stepped forward and said, what can we do to rebuild America? What can we do to donate blood? How do we come together as a country, Democrats and Republicans, to bring us together again and fix our country, make it a better place? That civic response is essential today to support our democracy. And the last norm I'll mention, or support for norms I'll mention, is just the technology and the education in our communities today. The telegraph, the newspaper, all these things were essential for us to have conversations about democracy, right? Between Democrats and Republicans. Here's a guy I really like a lot. He's a Republican. When I get on college campuses and I tell people he's like my brother, even though we disagree on a lot of things, they're like, Tim, how can you like a Republican? What is wrong with you? That's the enemy. No, he's my American citizen brother. Yeah, we don't agree on maybe 80% of the issues. We'll passionately go back and forth on those issues. But when he and I get together on a day like today, and we talk about democracy and America in our Constitution and the peaceful transfer of power, nothing will get in between us. We are absolutely there together. And today, technology, social media, technology platforms are being used by China and Iran and North Korea and Russia to divide us on purpose. It's an asymmetrical and cheap way to divide Americans. And we can't let that happen. So I know there's a lot more there. We can talk about specific things to get us going. I am just delighted to be here in Michigan, in the heartland, to talk about these very important issues.
I just want to begin with that. I mean, if you were using a telegraph, you're older than you look. I mean, we we had I think number one, I appreciate what you said about how important these conversations are and how honored all of us are to be here. This is thrilling for me, for the Carter Center, to partner and to continue this long partnership that my grandfather and President Ford had. And we've done work across the aisle, in cross-partisan ways, on these issues for a long time, mostly in other countries, right? You know, the support for democracy abroad, again, is not a partisan issue. And it shouldn't be. I think when I think back about running for office, when I was in the Georgia legislature, you know, like you guys, I had so many of my best, sort of closest personal friends were on the other side of the political divide from me, and I've maintained those relationships. And I think part of running for office, I heard I got, in fact, one of the things that they did when I was in the legislature is they had this small leadership conference, and they gave a definition of leadership. And it sounds funny when you first hear it, but this definition that let me try out on you guys. It is disappointing your followers at a rate that they can absorb. Okay. And think about the kind of leadership that if you're just following the people in your party or the people who support you, you're not really leading them anywhere they wouldn't already go. And so there has to be a moment. And I think Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford are two people who've done this. I think we can find it in many, many other leaders to say, listen, I know this is where you all think we should go, but in this moment, I know I'm going to disappoint you. But I'm going to do it for a reason that I think is important. And I'll just give you a specific example. And I think this is a big deal, and it's hard to do. In Georgia, we have a history of voter suppression, particularly of Black people. We have a history of voter suppression. We've done it over and over again in our past. And right now, my political party wants to talk about voter suppression all the time. But it's easier to vote in Georgia than it is in almost any other state. It is. It is easy to vote in Georgia. And so when you have a group of donors, like I did and like I do, who want to talk about something,
that probably isn't helpful to our democratic process, because it's important to acknowledge the history. And those fears are real. But it's also important to say, but today, in this state, it is easier to vote in Georgia than anywhere else. And that's just an example of not very many people in my party are willing to talk like that in my state, because they would have to disappoint some of their followers. But if they're doing that in order to support the system, to acknowledge that the system is working, to support the exhausted election workers that are out here doing the right thing, I think it's important. And I think I say that as a Democrat with a little bit of a challenge to folks on all parts of the aisle about what it is and how, as candidates and as leaders, we can support that democratic process, even if sometimes it requires us to disappoint folks a little bit.
Wow. So I define American exceptionalism, two pretty controversial words. I define American exceptionalism as our tradition of holding free and fair elections and accepting the results and peacefully transferring power. You can argue about American exceptionalism on the military front or foreign policy or healthcare or education or all these other things. You can't argue that for 248 years we've been exceptional in our adherence to those principles. So we are exceptional there, and that is very much at risk today, we all know. So when you ask about campaigning, the context for me is two people served in the House seat that I had the privilege of serving in for 16 years that set a pretty high standard. Estes Kefauver and then Bill Brock on two sides. And I study a lot of history and understand them, and I stood on the shoulders of Bill Brock, very dignified people like President Ford and President Carter that actually made contributions that put their country above any partisan desires, which is where we've got to get back to. But let's face it, candidates for office, well, the context I was going to tell you is that both of my grown children are in elected office. My son's the county mayor. My daughter's the district attorney. My son-in-law is an 18-year Special Forces Green Beret. So we are in it as a family.
Kids are smarter than
Absolutely. I serve, but they're also what I would call Republican truth tellers from the South that were challenged by the untruth tellers, and they won. And they serve with dignity and honor, and they accept the results of elections, and they talked about the 2020 election publicly, who won, who lost, and that we have to come together and go forward. And so it can still be done. So there's hope. But let's also, as John Meacham reminds me, he was a Cub reporter and covered my first campaign. There's a history of violence in American politics. This didn't just start yesterday. And politics is not beanball. It's tough. It's rough. And people passionately believe in what they believe in. But there are a couple of things that are not negotiable. And that is accepting the results and peacefully transferring power. So of all the principles, the two that are absolutely mandatory, if we are going to extend, or as Benjamin Franklin said, keep the republic, are the acceptance of the election results and the peaceful transfer of power. So we have to oppose all violence and have no tolerance for violence anywhere, as you said yesterday, Mike, because that's really what we have to do. But let's acknowledge that our candidates are a reflection of the American culture. Yesterday in Chattanooga, a 16-year-old got off the bus at Brainerd High School and was gunned down because he spoke out on social media against the Bloods. My daughter, the district attorney, sent our family a note last night about the history of this young man, that he was actually online. That culture beneath our candidates becomes reflected in the candidates that we see for public office. Don't forget, I used to tell Barney Frank was a friend of mine. I have no agreement with Barney Frank, but because as a freshman member of Congress, I was so privileged, I learned the first name of all 434 of my colleagues, both sides, so that I would call these people by their first name. And I had a lot of friends because people love to be called by their first name. One of them was Barney Frank, who I had very little to do with, but we became friends because I called him Barney, and he's like, "What are you doing calling me by my first name? You know, who are you?" And we became friends. But this is how you actually change the culture because as I told people back then, we are members of Congress, nothing but a reflection of the country. 435 different places, different representatives, because we're very diverse. But we do have this common denominator that we all agree on certain things. And we have to hearken back to those and change our expectations and aspirations about what we are to be if we are to keep the republic.
I'm going to thank you, by the way. I'm going to transition us to talking about money. So we know, like in a state AG race, we're looking at tens of millions of dollars. Presidential race, we're now looking at 2 to 3 billion. So given how money plays into campaigns today, how do you adhere to norms? How do you ensure that you are upholding what needs to be done for voters? How do you navigate that?
Jason?
Well, I mean, just to say one thing quickly, there's two ways I think that it impacts. One is, in this day and age, when my grandfather ran for governor of Georgia, he shook 600,000 hands, right? That's how he did it. And if you're going to run for governor of Georgia today, even when I ran 10 years ago, a different political era, you don't really get to shake hands. You go to fundraisers all day, every day. And there's nothing more isolating from the people that you're supposed to represent and spending all of your time with the richest people you can find, right? It is isolating. It is difficult. And what it does is it drags candidates, I think, into this disconnected and isolated environment. That's tough. And so that reduces some accountability. But the biggest problem that I see, and I'd love to hear you guys talk about that, aside from responding to donors, is there's so much money out there for which there is no accountability, right? I get to get up there and say, I did not say that, right? I mean, Brian Kemp and I are he'll text me if something happens. He got quoted in the paper one day when he was running against Stacey Abrams. That had nothing to do with me, saying that Jason Carter did such and such. And he sent me a text message that morning. He said, hey, I read in the paper that this. He's like, I didn't say that. That's out of context. I wouldn't do that. And I said, all right, thank you so much. I appreciate that. He's a good, we've known each other for a long time. That's a Ford Carter type of relationship. But if there's a $50 million super PAC that is unaffiliated with a candidate that gets to say whatever it wants, you have real accountability problems, even if you've got really excellent leaders. That's my 2 cents.
I think going back to when I first ran for Congress back in 1990, you didn't have Citizens United decision, which opened up the floodgates everywhere on money. You didn't have all these super PACs. You didn't have, as you just said, $2-3 billion in some of these races. It's hard to get your mind around. I was told by the people, Jason, that when I ran, and I ran in a Democratic primary to get the right to run against the Republican incumbent, and they said, you're going to have to spend, Tim, 7 to 8 hours a day raising money. And I said, no, I'm not. I am going to knock on doors. I'm going to, every single night for 18 months, I'm going to knock on doors in the snow, in the rain. We'll target those doors. We're not just going to go to any door in any farm and any, rural community. We're going to go after voters we think are open to maybe voting for a Democrat or a Republican district. We're going to be smart about this and use computers to do it, but I'm not spending all my time raising money. And to what was just said, people are being told over and over by a Republican who ran for president that the system's rigged, by a Democrat who ran for president saying the economic system is rigged. And so working middle-class, blue-collar people are hearing from both parties, the system doesn't work for you anymore. It's broken. It helps the rich, and all this money is out there, but it's not there for you. So candidates need to be able to go directly to these voters, directly to these people, and tell them, I am different. I'm independent from that. I am going to listen to why you lost your job, whether you think it was NAFTA, or you think it was China, or you think it was, technology. We're going to listen to you, and we want to do something about that so that the system works better for more Americans. I think the Democrats need to do a better job, especially in my heartland, my states like Indiana, reaching out to those people and having answers to them and listening to them. The next thing I just say very quickly, and I think the last panel was just terrific. They mentioned Braver Angels, a group that we work with, Zach and I work with Issue One. This is a group that goes right to the heart of America and has local people talking to one another, 20 people at a time, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats, getting in a room and listening to one another. They don't have to go out for dinner that night. They don't have to go out on dates. They don't have to love each other, but they get in the room for an hour or two and they listen to one another. They respectfully, and my parents raised us, you listen to people. God gave you 2 ears, use them. 1 mouth, do more listening than talking. And we need to get back to that in our local communities. It doesn't start at the federal level to solve all our problems. We've got to get this back in the local communities. And I remember when Zach and I were up, it was at, the Institute of Politics at Harvard or something, and we were up on the stage kidding one another. And a couple of students walk up to us and they go, we had no idea Democrats and Republicans could like each other. You guys seem to really respect each other. What's the deal? We have to show our students and our people modeling that every election isn't the end of America if a Republican wins. Imagine people saying Gerald Ford won and it's the end of America. No, people said, we're going to work with Gerald Ford. He's a good guy. The same things they said about Jimmy Carter. It's not the existential death threat if the other party wins. And we've got to moderate some of that rhetoric.
So Tim mentioned Issue One. He and I, for now almost 8 years, have been the bipartisan co-chairs of what's called the Reformers Caucus, which is over 200 former members of Congress and cabinet officials that in a bipartisan way agree with certain principles. And Issue One, when it was all started, was money in politics, because it was so out of balance that it just like polluted the whole process. And it's still a very, very important issue. But for the last 4 years, frankly, we've been focused on elections, because if you can't get past the next election on peacefully transferring power, money in politics won't matter, because literally everything hangs in the balance. But I left public service at 53 years old after 16 years in Congress. And now I'm looking at my next generation, because, again, both of my children and my son-in-law are very, very engaged in their 30s. And I believe that generation really deserves a comprehensive reform of how we conduct our elections and carry the entire process. And I think it's possible. Here's why. Conflict brings about change. And since 2016, we've been in conflict politically. Okay. Now, I would argue as a Republican that if Bernie Sanders had beat Hillary Clinton, y'all might have the warts instead of today us having the warts, because disruption was coming. The status quo, the establishment on both sides was under fire, and people were restless, from the far left progressives to the populist, pitchfork people on the right. And they're really not even on the right. So it's all been thrown up in the air. And people ask me all the time, so if Trump loses, where's the Republican Party going to go? Is there any hope that you can bring back Reagan Republicans? Because right now the party's been taken over. And I would just suggest that conflict can bring about resolution. And my friends around the world who I talk to a lot, they have great faith that we've endured a lot worse than this moment, because they study history and they realize that we have. And we bounce back because we ground ourselves in our Constitution and the guarantees and the rule of law and some of these basic tenets that have stood the test of time. And money in politics is part of it. But I believe this: we're overloaded on politics. We need like time limits. And you say, well, how do you do that? Well, let me give you an example. In Tennessee, in the legislature, a ruby red legislature with a Republican governor, when the legislature convenes the second Tuesday of January every year, no one can raise money until after May, when the legislature is in recess. No campaign events, no raising money, no fundraisers in the middle of legislation. Are there ways to responsibly disconnect the influence of money in politics? Yes, there are. I would love it if members of Congress could not raise money while the Congress meets in Washington, D.C. Why should we be called over to the Capitol Hill Club or the DCCC and solicit funding in the middle of a business day when we're being paid to legislate and try to improve the American system? There are ways to do this that if the public were really engaged, especially after this conflict, because it's like a hurricane blowing through town. Once the debris is everywhere on the floor, and it is, somebody's got to clean it up and put it back together. So I would argue that when we do that, and that day will come, because pendulum, you mentioned pendulum last night, the pendulum may have hit the wall, y'all. It may have hit the wall this week. That debate may have actually changed a paradigm. I don't know. But when the pendulum hits the wall and comes back, somebody's going to have to clean it up. I listen to the next generation because my children are engaged heavily, and they really would like a cleaner overhaul of how we do this. And it might include ranked choice voting. It darn sure includes the gerrymandering issue. I was the Republican co-sponsor for a decade of the independent commissions at the state level, and that's bubbling up from the bottom. Reforms start out there. They don't start in Washington. They start at the ground level. So let's follow these trends and get ready for the change that needs to come.
Thank you. I want to kind of do a little rapid fire on what were the non-negotiables when you were running or when you were in office, on just how you behaved, standards that you held for yourself, to ensure for this honest process. Anyone?
I think honesty, number one. Just
I would say, I agree, Jason, honesty with the voters, honesty with your campaign workers, telling people, I'm not going to be out there raising money 8 or 9 hours a day, and I'm going to make this a people-oriented campaign.
And how is that done? Well, the media has a responsibility. I mean, honestly, I grew up with Walter Cronkite, and I remember these moments where the media was actually above all this. And now it's just propaganda on both sides. And John Meacham held me accountable in 91 and 92 as the reporter for telling the truth. Wait a second. You're not telling the truth. So the truth is fundamental, and the truth is not relative. And you don't have your truth and their truth. That's the way some people look at this now. I would encourage you to read a book from Michael Ware called The Spirit of Our Politics. Because in that book, I sent him a note about this. I know him. And I said, I love what you said, that we should belong to a political party because of what we believe. We should not believe because we belong to a political party. Think about that.
And I swear, I think one of the things we laughed about Notre Dame and Michigan, at least we all laughed about them last week. But anyway, but
Jason, let me correct. I did not laugh. I cried. Northern Illinois, at least you lost to Texas.
But we oftentimes, what you just said resonated with me about this, because we sometimes think about politics like it's whatever, Georgia and Auburn or Notre Dame or Ohio State and Michigan, right? You're not allowed to like the other side, and you're in it to win, and you become a fan instead of somebody who is, and it becomes about winning and losing, right? The most compelling arguments that we hear from our politicians right now is that they're winning. It's not, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And I just think that what you said really resonated with me. And we end up in these sides thinking that other team, if they win, we lose, and I think that we got to get out of that. I will say that we had 3 rules in the Carter campaign, in the 2014 one. It was work as hard as you can, always tell the truth, and no drinking and tweeting. Literally. Those were the 3 rules. So we imposed that 3rd one at some point.
We're going to now talk about accountability in the electoral space. And I'll just say that I was in New Mexico in 2008 working for the presidential. I was working on the Bush campaign. I had taken a leave of absence from my job. And there was a moment, I'm not going to name names, but we were on the phone with a high up Republican person that was, we were accountable to on the campaign. And we said, we think election fraud is going on in this part of New Mexico. It's going to happen. Da, da. And this person said, we're not going to call it, because if we call it here, they're going to call us out in Georgia. And it was a moment for me where I was like, this is wow. I can't believe I'm hearing this, but I just heard this. And it exists, right? Corruption exists, dirty politics exists, dirty campaigns, all of that stuff. It's kind of built in. So how do we change this? Are there effective mechanisms to put in place? Are there reforms? Like what can be done to kind of transform politics as is in your minds? Or what did you do? Or
I'll start. Because we have this fragmented 50 state system, and as you pointed out yesterday, even down to the county level, and you have to have some kind in this modern era, some kind of best practices that we all agree to on how to conduct your elections and how they should be carried out. And I was saying, I just wrote an op-ed on this, and I'm not going to do it over issue 1 or the National Council of Election Integrity or More Perfect or anything I belong to. I'm doing it as an individual citizen because I believe we have to have a compromise where both sides can say, okay, I'm going to agree to this. You can't just say, intellectually, this is the way it's got to be and expect everybody to agree to it, because confidence has been lost. And in order to restore confidence, we got to have a compromise. And I think we ought to have like a good housekeeping seal of approval of how to carry out these elections, that people would actually embrace a new way forward after this conflict, so that we can hold each other accountable to this. I mean, pledges, I get it. Pledges are good, but pledges are broke oftentimes. So this set of principles that people can agree to, and you can pledge to agree to the principles. But again, how's the accountability? Well, people do have to be held accountable through the media, because that's how we still get our information, but we get it in different ways. So social media platforms are the media, really. They have some responsibility built in here. Whole nother issue, but the Congress inadvertently in 1996 exempted the media, the platforms, from any legal liability. That was a mistake. Dick Gephardt and I just wrote a long form op-ed that comes out like today on how that was a bipartisan mistake to completely exempt the platforms from any legal liability for anything they do. In the name of never regulating the internet, we allowed them to get away with, frankly, negligence or even malice, because in the name of making money, they allow algorithm perpetuation to take people to the lowest common denominator in our society and divide us in a powerful way without us even knowing it. And it's happening now with zero accountability through the platforms, and that's how most people are getting their information.
I'd say 3 things. One, money in politics. We have to address it. It is swamping the system and causing trust to go away. Gerrymandering. I ran in a district that was a swing district. A Democrat could win it, a Republican could win it. We have 435 seats in the United States Congress. Guess how many of those, and when I ran in 1990, were competitive? Not 435, not 200, about 150. Today, 2024, how many of those are competitive? About 30 to 50, depending upon if it's an off year or a presidential year. So redistricting gerrymandering is absolutely key to getting moderate, in the middle Republicans and Democrats that represent 70% of our country into office where they want to work together, not where if you want to work with a Republican, somebody says to me in my party, oh, you like Zach Wamp? I'm not voting for you. You want to work with Gerald Ford? I'm not going to vote for you. That has to be finished in American politics. We see our legislation, bipartisan legislation, is the legislation that lasts, that is implemented, that goes over time, like civil rights legislation and other important things that have passed. I also think that in addition to the money side, we have to fund our election systems at the federal level. We need to be able to say to our local communities, rural communities. I mean, I make this argument to my Republican friends all the time. They are strapped more than anybody else. They have to buy new equipment. They have to track their votes. They are getting hit by the Chinese and the Russians, sometimes even more so than the big city metropolitan areas because they're seen as vulnerable. They need some continuous federal funding to support their systems, update them, and protect them from national security threats. E pluribus unum. We are all in this together, and we need to put that federal funding out there. Last thing I would say is we need to talk about our election system in ways that are positive and make it seem to people, this works. We've got the best system in the world. We have the envy of the world here in America. They're not run in DC. They're not run by a bureaucracy. They're run by our neighbors, our families, our volunteers go there, and they ask you when you go up to vote, they say, hey, Tim, how you doing? Let me see your ID. Where do you live? Okay, what ballot do you want? Here you go, Tim. And then they count it. There's a Democrat and a Republican. That's how our system works. It's not something manipulated, in DC in some kind of grand deep state. And the more we explain to people through civic education in our high schools, this is the way we have this system. You need to volunteer. You need to help make it work. I think that really positively supports our system.
I just want to tag on that last comment. I mean, I think even this group, we all, and Heather and I were sitting in the back talking about this. Our system, there are examples like you gave about, you've uncovered something or something happens, and it is imperfect because so is every system, but it works. And there's a huge difference. The Carter Center has observed 110 or so elections in 40-something countries over the last 4 decades. And it is very easy to see errors. It is very hard to, quote, steal an election. It is very hard. And what would happen in a small place, knowing what that actually looks like from an education standpoint would be interesting and important, right? Like I have walked out of an election count in a national election in a foreign country and looked at a gaggle of television reporters and said, we believe this result lacks credibility, and the result, not just these things, but this is something that changes the result. I have walked in another country to a precinct where they were literally stuffing the ballot box, and I saw it with my own eyes. And the question then becomes, what does that do to the outcome of the election, right? A trusted result can come from something that's not exactly perfect, right? But your point about being positive about it is we have to temper our legitimate criticism and our legitimate concern, coming back to your point, which is at the end of the day, is the result credible? And the answer is it can be imperfect with a credible result. And I think that level of education, there's some nuance there that's really important, but it is real. And we've lived with that for years. And we've lived with it over and over and over again for years. And by the way, the last thing I'll say about this, the rule of law controls it. Every single election, you have the ability to come afterwards, to challenge it, to put your evidence in, to bring everything that you can in, and to go to a court of law with the same, people who decide our other important disputes and decide it on the facts and the law. And we have that. And that has worked. I mean, it has worked. 60-something challenges by, say, Republicans in the last election or Democrats and others. We've gone through, and in Georgia, just to give 2 examples, Trump-appointed federal judges said this is not a problem with respect to Trump's challenges. And frankly, Obama-appointed judges in the federal bench have looked at other challenges and said this is not a problem when brought by people from the left. So you've got that backstop, and I think that our confidence needs to be well placed, and we need to do that in addition to those transformations.
Completely. And we're going to talk a little bit about political polarization. So we know it's very high right now. I was kind of baffled yesterday. I was watching some news coverage of the 9/11 commemoration, and the newscasters were like, and the presidential candidates are acknowledging each other. And I was, this is so bad. It's like fundamental. I mean, what has happened? It's really bad. You all are, it's admirable how you like each other. It's authentic, but I mean, what are the practical things that we can do, can model I mean, Congressman Wamp, you just talked about knowing everyone's name. Like, what are the things on a very base level that we can do to decrease this polarization, which then like kind of feeds into, decreasing the risk for actual violence?
Tim talked about listening. One of my favorite books about the faith is from Henry Nouwen, and he talks about the ministry of presence, where the most important thing you can do is just spend time listening to others in terms of a ministry rather than like preaching to them or telling them what they've got to do in order to change. The best and most effective ministry is to actually sit and listen to them. So not just learning their names, but learning their story and hearing their story and caring for them and realizing that our enemy, which 9/11 reminded us of, are people who don't like our way of life, our freedoms that are built into our Constitution. And that's our enemy, people that would actually destroy that, not the people who are debating how we do that. That's all that Democrats and Republicans are. I voted for his grandfather in 1976. In a weird sort of a change as a Southerner, I voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980. But I don't believe that
uncommon. I mean,
no, that's right. A lot of people do that. But
Where
either
we lose you, Zach.
but neither party has an exclusive on integrity or ideas. And we actually must get back to respecting that we are just opponents, but not enemies, and that we are all fundamentally the same. And that is now lost temporarily in the American political debate and environment. And we have to get back to that. I will tell you to be encouraged that my children don't think that way. Our generation, my generation, are the villains here. And the sooner we get out of the way and all the 80-year-old people that are still in elected office go home and let younger people under 50, Democrats and Republicans, they don't really argue over things that they're not going to ever agree about. They're much more pragmatic, and they just want things to work again. And they have a lot better chance of fixing this than we do. So we need to encourage all the elderly people in elected office to go home and find someone that's young that they can actually mentor to have impact and let the next generation do this. You're still under 50, so you're part of that.
You're exempt, Jason. You can run.
not for long, not for long, not for long.
I think answering your question, I mean, this is not the most recent example of it, but you can be part of the norms. You can be positive about America. You can be respectful to one another, and you can win. I'll give you an example. I won't go too far back. Back in 2008, I was one of the first people to endorse Barack Obama. And as a result, not because I was any good at going out and speaking with him or for him or campaigning for him, nobody else did. Everybody was on Hillary Clinton's side. So I had the opportunity to be out there in 6, 7, 8, 9 different states campaigning with him. And we kept making the argument to David Axelrod and David Plouffe and others, you can win Indiana. Indiana, you can win this state. And they would say initially, oh, no, you can't. Hadn't voted for a Democrat since 1964 in Johnson. We said, we think that there's a message that people are going to be receptive to here. So finally, we were able to convince the candidate and his advisors to spend time in Indiana. And he did a couple things. He showed up. My parents always say, show up. You got to be there, show up, work hard. He did. He came into Indiana 49 times. Secondly, we put him down in front of people who were angry. And he would tell us afterwards sometimes, hey, why did you do that? That was not a lot of fun, getting screamed at. And we said, you've got to listen to a lot of these folks that have a legitimate story about displacement and interruption and alienation in America. And third, he had some answers to that alienation and that quick, not 18 policy papers that he would give them. Here's what I'll do to try to help you. I can't fix every problem, but here's what I'll do. Ended up Barack Obama won Indiana for the first time since 1964 because he showed up. He was positive. He had some answers. He listened. and he did the work. So I agree with both Zach and Jason. I think we are in an abyss right now. We're going to come out of it. America has been through these periods before, revolution and civil war and civil rights and Vietnam. This is a tough period. This is a very challenging period for us. But I think at the heart of it, the soul of America, we are going to come out of this and rebound, and it's already starting.
And I'll just tag on to this in this one way. Georgia elected a Republican governor and a Democratic senator in its last election, right? That does a couple things. Number one, it helps you say your election was fair, right? Because there's nobody that's complaining. But Raphael Warnock, who's a good friend of mine, was at my house 2 weeks ago. We have a lot of stuff going on in my family. And he looked at me and he said, you know, the most important thing is the ministry of presence. And so you just repeated that today. And I know you probably disagree with him on all kinds of policy things, but there are fundamental parts of being a human that are real. And for some people, it's their faith. Obviously, for my grandfather, that was a fundamental part of his life and his drive. But that connection that you just made with Raphael Warnock that you didn't know you had, and then you just talked about showing up. And I think that concept of the ministry of presence, the more time you actually get to spend together, this is what modeling looks like. I think that in Georgia, we have done a lot of there needs to be space for people to be together. And I think more often than not, we spend so much time now in our social media bubbles that don't allow us to be present with other people. And I don't mean physically present even. I mean, even being exposed to the kinds of ideas that we want, because everybody, the easiest thing ever to convince somebody of is that they're right. Right? Everyone is very susceptible to that argument. I think you're right. You're right. You're right. And if that's all they hear, they're never present with anybody else. I just think that's where we're going. And I just, that affected me, and you followed it up by Barack Obama showing up. And I just think all of us need an opportunity to show up and be present together in real ways.
Well, thank you. What a lovely way to end this. So appreciate you all. Thank you for your time. And I think now it's a break. Thank you.